This lesson is about the GridBag layout manager. Of all the layout managers, this one is the most complicated to use, but it could also be considered the most flexible. I'm going to try to not make any editorial comments about it. I'll just show you how it works. It's based on a grid, sort of like the grid layout manager, but each column can be a different width. In a similar fashion, each row can be a different height. This means that you can have oblong-shaped openings in the grid in which you can stick components. The heights and widths of the grid openings are set according to weight values you assign to them. Also, a component can be inserted so that it covers more than one of these grid openings. Notice that this layout manager requires two import statements. That's because it requires the use of two classes. The GridBag layout class is the layout manager itself, and the GridBag constraints object is a convenience class used to set up the constraint values for each individual component as it is added to the container. We're going to be using a bunch of buttons for our components, so this is a general purpose reference to be used as a holding area while we work on each one. Here we construct a GridBag constraints object. We can use the same one over and over because its only purpose is to contain parameter values passed to a method. In a different design, this same thing could have been done by having each parameter listed on the method call, but there are 10 of them, and you normally want to just let most of them default anyway. If they were all listed on a method call, you'd have to code the default value for all of the ones you didn't even want to change. This line of code creates the new GridBag layout manager. Notice that you don't have to specify the size of the grid like we did with the grid layout manager. This manager is smart enough to figure out how many cells it needs in its grid as components are added to it. Here, the GridBag layout manager is set as the layout manager for this panel. Now, this is the first button. The label on the button is set to indicate its location in the grid. Before we add it to the panel, it's necessary to set the constraints for it. So here, two of the parameters are set in the GridBag constraints object. The values GridX and GridY place the component in its location in the grid. Just like with the add method we used with the border layout manager, we use the add method that includes a constraints object. In that case, it was a specification of the position, north, south, so on. In this case, it's the whole set of constraints in the GridBag constraints object. Of course, everything inside this object is set to the default values, except GridX and GridY, which are set to indicate the button location. If we let that default for each button, they would all go in the same location in the grid. Anyway, we add a total of 6 buttons to the panel, each one in a different position, and each one's label showing what position it is. The program looks like this when it runs. You can see that the way we positioned the buttons there along the top and left side of the GridBag. If we resize this window, the buttons all remain with their existing constraints, size, and relative positions, and the whole GridBag tries to center itself in the window. The reason the buttons all stayed clustered together is because they all have the same weight value, and that weight value is 0 in both the X and Y directions. The value of the weight is a multiplier used as a factor in determining the space between the components and the sizing of the components. The GridBag layout is a very dynamic layout manager. Let's give the buttons a bit of weight so they'll spread out and try to fill the window. Now, this program is the same as the previous one, except we've added weight values to the button components. The weight values of each component are relative values among them, and the weights for all of the buttons that in this program are set to the same, so the sizing of their grids and thus the spacing of the buttons will all be the same.